The snow had fallen for 3 days straight, smothering the valley in a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Mateo Rivas was just a poor rancher trying to survive the cold, his fields blackened by last season's fire, his hope long turned to ash. But that morning, on the edge of his ruined land, he saw it. A massive grey horse, chained to an old oak, ribs showing beneath a coat of frost. A crumpled note hung from the iron links, its words half frozen. "Leave it.
Keep us safe. He should have turned away. He had nothing left to give."
But when the horse met his eyes, trembling, waiting, almost human in its silence, Mateo lifted his axe and struck the lock. The chain shattered, and in that single breath of freedom, something unseen awakened in the valley. Because this wasn't a rescue, it was the beginning of a reckoning, and neither man nor beast would ever be the same again. Wind carried the faint scent of smoke, though the sky above Mateo's valley was still the color of pewter and silence. He had risen before dawn, as he always did, to mend the northern fence where winter had chewed through the wire. The air was brittle, his breath a small ghost that vanished against the pale trees. Then he saw it. Something dark and impossibly large, standing at the edge of the meadow, half shrouded in mist. The shape did not move at first, and Mateo thought it a trick of fog. But as he drew closer, the air thickened with the smell of iron and sweat. Beneath an old oak, a horse stood chained to the trunk, an animal so massive it seemed carved from the mountain itself. Its coat, a mottled grey bruised by frost, clung in wet patches to skin scored with marks where metal had bitten too long. The chain was buried in snow and rust, wrapped tight across the chest like punishment. A scrap of paper, stiff with ice, fluttered against the iron link. Mateo reached for it with the caution of a man touching grief. The words were brief, written in a trembling hand. "Leave it. Keep us safe." He read them twice, then folded the paper into his glove.
As if the cold might erase it. He studied the animal's face, wide nostrils rimmed with frost, eyes as dark and steady as wells.
The creature didn't shy or threaten. It simply watched him, a quiet verdict passing between them in the hush of the snow. He could have turned away. It would have been the sensible thing to do. He had debts waiting in the kitchen drawer, feed enough for 2 weeks, no more. His life was built on careful survival. But some silences demand an answer. He stepped closer, boots sinking with a hollow crunch, and spoke softly, the way one might to a child or a ghost. "Easy, boy." The horse's breath rolled in steam, then steadied. Mateo ran his gloved hand along the chain, feeling the tremor of warmth beneath the frozen metal. He tugged once. The sound of strained iron cracked through the stillness like distant thunder. When the chain gave a single groan, the horse did not bolt. It only lowered its head, exhaling a long, exhausted sigh that fogged the air between them. Mateo knew then what he would do, not because it was wise, but because it was right. He fetched his axe from the saddle and struck the lock until it split. The last link fell with a dull clang that echoed across the valley. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, only snow drifting between them like ash. Then the horse lifted its head toward the ridgeline where smoke bruised the horizon, and Mateo understood. This freedom was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. Before the smoke thickened into omen, the valley had been quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, only reminds you what's missing. Mateo's life had narrowed to the sound of boots on frozen dirt, the creak of the barn hinge, and the slow ticking of a stove that never burned hot enough. His wife's shawl still hung on the back of the chair near the hearth, brittle from years of dust and sunlight. He hadn't had the heart to move it. He had inherited the land after his father's passing, though inheritance was a generous word. What remained was a skeletal ranch, fences bent like old men, a barn patched more with hope than timber, and debts that outlived love. Every day began with repair, wire, wood, will. Every night ended the same. A single lamp, a silent prayer, a stare into nothing. When he brought the horse home, the barn felt less like a tomb. The animal filled the space in ways Mateo couldn't have anticipated. He named it Thorn, though not for malice, for endurance. The horse bore pain the way the land bore drought, stubbornly, without complaint. Thorn's hooves left perfect half-moons in the frost, prints Mateo began to follow like scripture. The first days were uneasy. Thorn wouldn't eat. He stood near the stall door, head bowed, listening. The chain marks along his neck oozed faintly, a map of past restraint. Mateo cleaned them with salt water and patience, whispering nonsense to fill the air. "You'll stay till the thaw," he murmured. "Then we'll see what the world wants with us both." At night, wind carried the smell of burning from far off. Brush fires, perhaps, or someone clearing fields too soon. Mateo found himself waking before dawn, stepping to the barn to check on Thorn. Each time, the horse greeted him with the same quiet stillness, eyes deep and unreadable. Yet beneath that calm, something flickered, not fear, but remembrance, the neighbors noticed, of course. Word spreads faster than weather in a place that small. At the feed store, old men chewed tobacco and muttered about curses.
"That's the Baron's beast," one said.
"The one that threw his son into the gorge." Another spat into the dirt. "Best shoot it now before misfortune breeds." Mateo pretended not to hear. The gossip clung like soot. Still a question troubled him. Why would anyone leave such an animal alive, chained in plain sight? It wasn't cruelty born of neglect. It felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. The note's phrasing, "keep us safe," turned in his mind like a thorn in cloth. Safe from what? One morning, while brushing Thorn's coat, Mateo noticed something snagged deep in the mane, a burned ribbon, blackened at the edges. He teased it loose, turning it in his fingers.
Not silk, not cloth, but a strip of uniform trim, charred and stiff.
The colour beneath the soot wasn't the Baron's heraldic red, but a deep indigo, nearly black. Military, maybe, or servant attire. The realization tightened his chest. Whoever chained Thorn had wanted to mislead anyone who looked too closely. That night, he placed the ribbon beside his father's old photograph, the one taken before the great drought, when the land still held promise. Two men staring into time, each with something precious already slipping away. Outside, Thorn shifted in the barn. The sound was low, rhythmic, like breath syncing with heartbeat. Mateo leaned back in his chair, eyes on the small flame in the stove. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about loss or debt. He was thinking about endurance. How some things survive not because they are untouched by fire, but because they learn to carry its memory without burning again. In the distance,
thunder rolled across the ridge, but it wasn't thunder.
It was the dry, snapping language of wind through dead grass, a warning whispered in heat and ash. By morning, the horizon would be lined with smoke. By the third week, the wind no longer carried the scent of winter, but the dry crackle of something waiting to ignite. The mountains to the west shimmered beneath a faint orange haze that deepened each night, a bruise spreading across the sky. Mateo had seen fires before, but never this early, never this fierce. He rose before dawn, feeding Thorn what little grain remained. The horse's coat had regained its sheen, muscles filling out beneath the pale scars that laced his neck. But the creature's eyes were different now, more alert, restless, haunted by something Mateo couldn't name. Sometimes Thorn would lift his head sharply, ears pricking toward the distant ridge, nostrils flaring as if catching a scent Mateo couldn't. That morning, while repairing the east fence, Mateo heard it, the distant thunder of hooves carried on the wind. At first he thought it was storm echo, but the rhythm was too deliberate. He climbed the rise near the old oak and squinted toward the valley mouth. A convoy of riders was moving through the smoke, their outlines wavering like mirages. Dust clung to their coats, and the banners on their saddles were the same deep indigo as the ribbon he had found tangled in Thorn's mane. He didn't move. Something in him understood that the men weren't passing through, they were searching. When the riders reached the pasture fence, the one in front dismounted. His coat was trimmed in gold, his boots clean despite the dust. His face was hidden beneath a wide hat, but his voice carried clear. "Afternoon, rancher. You seen a grey draft horse come through this way? Big one."
Scar on the neck? Mateo felt his throat tighten.
Thorn was inside the barn, invisible from this distance. He shook his head slowly. "No horse like that here."
Only my own. The man studied him for a moment too long, then smiled thinly.
"If you do, you best let us know. That animal's dangerous. Killed 2 men and nearly a third." They rode on, leaving behind only the churned earth of their passing. Mateo stood there long after they disappeared, heart hammering. He wanted to believe it was a lie, some rumor-grown teeth, but the look in Thorn's eyes told him otherwise. That evening, he walked into the barn and found Thorn pacing the stall, nostrils flaring. The horse stopped when Mateo approached, lowering his head in shame or warning. He couldn't tell which. "What did they do to you?" Mateo whispered. Thorn exhaled sharply, stamping once, the sound echoing like a drumbeat. When he unlatched the stall, Thorn didn't bolt. Instead, he pressed his forehead to Mateo's shoulder, breath warm and ragged. The gesture was neither threat nor plea. It was confession. Mateo stroked the scar along his neck, tracing the ridge of healed flesh. The truth wasn't clear, but it no longer mattered. Whatever Thorn had done, or been forced to do, had been born of human cruelty. Outside, the wind shifted, and the smell of smoke thickened. By midnight, the horizon was aflame. Sheets of orange light flickered against the undersides of clouds, turning the valley into a shallow bowl of reflection. Mateo packed what he could into his truck, tools, ledgers, his father's photograph, and led Thorn out of the barn. The air was hot enough to sting. Sparks fell like fireflies, carried on a wind that screamed through the pines. Halfway to the main road, the fire closed in faster than he could drive. The tires spun in ash, vision reduced to streaks of ember and panic. He had no choice but to cut across the creek bed on foot, Thorn stumbling behind him through the thick smoke. The horse coughed, a deep, guttural sound that tore through the wind, and Mateo felt the pull of the lead rope nearly jerk him off balance. "Easy," he gasped, voice breaking. "We're close. Just a bit further." But the fire was a wall now, red and roaring. Every exit was closing. The only direction left was toward the ridge, the same ridge where the riders had come. When they reached the slope, Thorn stopped. Mateo tugged, but the horse refused to move, eyes locked on something ahead. Through the firelight, he could see the glint of metal, the same indigo uniforms, the riders retreating uphill.
One of them turned and pointed. There! The horse!
Gunfire cracked, deafened by the storming blaze. Mateo dropped behind a fallen log, heart pounding. Bullets sparked against stone. Thorn reared, screaming, a terrible sound of fury and fear. The lead rope snapped free. "Thorn!" Mateo shouted, choking on ash. But the horse charged forward, not away, but toward the gunfire. Through the haze, Mateo saw him crash into one of the riders, sending both into the flames. Another shot rang out, then another, until the smoke swallowed everything. When silence returned, it was heavy and final. The fire roared on, indifferent. Mateo stumbled through the black haze, calling Thorn's name. His voice came out raw, fading into the endless rush of heat and wind. At last, he found the horse, standing in a small clearing, the ground around him scorched but unburned. Thorn's sides heaved, eyes wild and bright as molten glass. Blood streaked his flank. The chain that had once bound him hung from his neck, its end glowing faintly red. Mateo pressed his hand to the horse's muzzle, trembling.
"We're not done," he said hoarsely.
Not yet. Behind them the valley burned like a memory too painful to keep. Ahead, the path up the ridge was lit in ember light, a narrow road between ruin and redemption, and though neither could see the summit, they began to climb. Winter's ash did not fall like neat confession. It settled in layers, grey and sticky, clinging to fence posts and the seams of Mateo's coat. Days after the blaze, the valley looked as if someone had taken a blade to its map. Trees blackened at the edges, pastures scarred with lines of dead grass, and the river carrying a thin film of soot like a tired ribbon. Mateo moved through it all with the slow care of a man cataloguing loss, as if that could make it smaller. Thorn stood in the barn with a filthy bandage along one flank, the wound beneath cleaned and dressed but still angry. He did not neigh. He remained a patient, immense presence whose breathing kept time with the house. Mateo fed him measured rations, each handful a careful arithmetic against dwindling stores. The horse was patient in a way that felt like reproach and blessing at once. When Thorn shifted his weight, the boards creaked, and the sound was like a far-off cry. Rumour gathered faster than aid. The riders with indigo banners rode into town and told a version of the night that placed Thorn at the centre of violence, an animal that had charged without cause, whose presence threatened men and property. Some believed it, some only repeated it. The Baron's household sent nothing but careful statements. Merchants crossed the street when Mateo passed. The feed dealer insisted on cash up front. Invitations to community work stopped arriving. Matters of survival sharpened. Water now carried a fine grit that settled at the bottom of the pail. The truck refused to start for lack of a coil Mateo could not afford. Nights were for mending, Thorn's shelter patched with scavenged planks tied into prayers, the barn a collage of hope and rope. Mateo worked until his hands bled, and the ache of labour was the only thing that kept his thoughts from wandering into darker rooms. He began to dream in echoes. Sometimes he saw his father on the ridge, hands deep in pockets, head tipped to the west, as if listening for a tune the valley no longer played.
Other nights the dreams were of fire, the roar, the pop of sap exploding, a child's small shoe at a bank, and he would wake with ash in his mouth.
The photograph of his father that he kept behind the cupboard felt sharper each day, like a witness waiting for him to answer in a restless, practical hour. He pried loose a board in the barn and found a small hollow where someone had once slipped things away. There, folded and yellowed, was a photograph not of his father alone, but of his father beside a great grey horse. Man and beast posed like a promise. The ribbon in the horse's mane was dark, almost indigo beneath the stains. The discovery hit him with the first electric guilt. Threads that might tie Thorn to his land ran deeper than rumour. He turned the image over in his hands, searching the creased back for a name, a date, any punctuation that might explain why the photograph had been hidden. There was only the faint ghost of a pencil stroke that might once have been a child's mark. The photograph offered no answers, only the suggestion that stories had roots deeper than gossip. He continued with the work of small salvation, Thorn responded. Where once Thorn had flinched at the scrape of a halter, now he leaned into the tug of a lead rope with soft patience. Children who had once peered from porches began to wander nearer, offering an apple or a carrot. The sight of them eased Mateo in ways payment never had. The simplest acts, a nickering that stopped a child from crying, a steady step beside an old woman, made a slow ledger of grace. The Baron's influence lingered like weather. Notices arrived in brass mailbox slots, curt requests, surveys, offers of assistance tied to conditions. Stewards walked through the valley like men who had never known hunger, offering charity in numbers. Mateo declined most of it. He would not let Thorn become a bargaining chip, nor let ownership hinge on purse or pressure. He mended fences, fed hooves, and went out into the fields with a shovel and stubbornness. At night, he sat on the stoop and listened to the land exhale. Thorn shifted in his stall and the sound travelled like a low hymn. The valley recovered in small increments. Saplings showed green. A leaned post stood straighter after Mateo drove it deep. People came and went with the tide of need, some offering help for grief they would not name, others seeking the legend before it fully formed. For every hand that reached out with suspicion, two reached with something kinder. One afternoon, old Marta from down the lane came by with a battered tin of stew, and the kind of silence that wraps an apology. She would not look him in the eye as she set the bowl down, but Thorn nosed her hand, and she laughed, a surprised sound that seemed to startle the dust from the air. Small mercies like that arrived like rain, unexpected, wet, and life-giving. He began to collect small objects, a charred ribbon, a flattened horseshoe found by the ridge, a scrap of the note he had tucked in his glove. He kept them in a tin beneath the floorboard where his father's photograph had rested. They were not legal proof, but artifacts of truth, pieces of a life that declared itself through objects when words failed. Sometimes he took them out and arranged them on his knee, as if laying out a map he could learn to read. And in the moments when fatigue threatened to give way to despair, Thorn would nudge his hand with slow, precise pressure that said, "Continue." It was not sentiment so much as insistence, an animal's way of asking a man to stay. So Mateo stayed. He leaned into chores, into slow repair of things, both physical and moral. The valley watched him work, and the watching softened until rumor, while still present, could no longer direct every step. He kept tending on. Spring arrived without asking permission. It crept through the valley with a shy warmth that turned ash to soil, coaxed stubborn shoots through black earth, and softened the sound of wind in the eaves. The fire's scars still traced the ridges like old handwriting, but green had begun to reclaim the page. Mateo no longer woke to silence. Each dawn began with Thorn's deep, rhythmic breathing from the barn and the flutter of sparrows stitching small songs through the rafters. For months, man and horse had labored side by side, repairing fences, clearing debris, planting hay along the creek bed. The rhythm of their work became a kind of healing, though neither would name it as such. Thorn's strength returned first. The horse's coat shone like brushed steel beneath morning light, his movement purposeful, no longer burdened by the invisible weight of chains. Sometimes Mateo would pause mid-task, watching Thorn move across the pasture with a slow grace that reminded him of forgiveness. Something not given, but discovered when one learns to stop fighting the ground beneath their own feet. Then came the first visitor. A boy of 10, thin as willow bark, appeared one afternoon while Mateo was mending tack. His mother followed at a distance, her face drawn tight with apology. "He heard about your horse," she said softly.
"Since the fire."
"He doesn't talk much." "We thought maybe—" She didn't finish. Mateo nodded. He didn't promise anything. He simply led the boy toward Thorn's pasture, stopping at the fence. Thorn lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Then, without prompting, the horse crossed the field, his heavy steps stirring small clouds of dust that hung in the golden air. The boy froze. Thorn stopped 3 feet away, towering yet impossibly still. Mateo felt the air tighten between them. Two kinds of silence meeting, one human, one animal, both fragile. Then Thorn lowered his great head and exhaled softly, his breath touching the boy's sleeve. The boy's hand rose, uncertain, shaking, and pressed against the velvet of Thorn's nose. For a long moment neither moved. When the boy's mother began to cry, it wasn't grief. It was the sound of something opening. After they left, Mateo sat beside Thorn in the pasture until dusk. "You knew," he murmured. Thorn flicked an ear, the faintest gesture of acknowledgement. The setting sun caught his eyes, turning them amber, like fire made gentle. Words spread quietly this time. No gossip, no spectacle. Just families coming by one, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. An old man who hadn't spoken since his wife's passing stood by the fence for an hour before whispering her name into the wind. A young woman with burn scars on her arms found herself brushing Thorn's mane without fear. Each left lighter, though none could say why. Mateo began to understand that Thorn's gift wasn't magic, it was memory. The ability to bear pain without turning away from it. Where others saw strength, he saw patience. Where they saw mystery, he saw reflection. Thorn did not heal people. He simply allowed them to face what had been chained within. One evening, as Mateo brushed the horse's coat under a violet sky, he caught his own reflection in Thorn's eye. Older, yes, but steady, unafraid. The sight startled him. For years, he had carried his failures like lead, believing survival was his only worth. But in that reflection he saw a man who had stayed when others left, a man who had chosen compassion over comfort. The next morning he found a letter wedged beneath the barn door. The paper was fine, the handwriting deliberate. "Mr. Mateo Rivas, the matter of the grey draft horse remains unresolved. We request your presence at the courthouse on the 10th. Please bring proof of ownership." It was unsigned, but the ink smelled faintly of cedar, the Baron's stationery. For the rest of the day, Mateo couldn't focus. He knew what the letter meant. They hadn't forgotten. They would come to reclaim what they once tried to destroy. By nightfall he had decided. He would go, not to fight for possession, but for truth. In the last light, he stood before Thorn, resting a hand against the broad curve of the horse's neck. "They'll come for you," he said.
"And maybe I can't stop them, but I can speak." Thorn breathed slow and deep,
the air from his lungs brushing Mateo's wrist. For the first time in years, the rancher smiled, not out of victory, but resolve. When the wind carried the scent of rain across the fields, Thorn lifted his head toward it, nostrils wide, eyes calm, and Mateo felt it. The same stillness he'd seen in the boy, the old man, the burned woman, a quiet truth that had nothing to do with miracles. Sometimes it's not salvation we're given, it's the chance to stand in the smoke and stay. The courthouse sat on the far side of the valley, its brick walls stained by decades of dust and rain. Mateo hadn't been there since his father's funeral, a day that smelled of soap and thunder and unspoken debts. When he tied Thorn's reins to the hitching post outside and stepped through those doors again, it felt like walking into a mouth that swallowed sound. The hearing was already in motion. At the long table by the window sat two men in pressed coats, papers stacked before them like weapons. One was the Baron's steward, thin, sharp, a man who spoke as though every word had been rehearsed twice. The other wore a state insignia and the expression of someone who thought mercy was inefficient. They didn't look up until Mateo removed his hat. "Mr. Rivas," the steward said with a brittle smile, "we're glad you came."
"I trust the animal is still alive."
Mateo's jaw tightened. "Alive," he said.
"And mending? Good." The steward slid a folder across the table.
"Then you'll understand our position. That horse is a matter of liability. Records show it belonged to the late Captain Arden of the militia, a valuable military asset, until it killed its handler and was ordered destroyed. Someone interfered with that order." He let the words hang in the room like a noose. Mateo looked at the papers, but didn't touch them.
And if I say the horse was chained and abandoned to die?
The official shrugged. Then we'd ask why a civilian with no claim risked his life to save it. The law favors those who can prove ownership. And what does the law make of compassion? Mateo asked quietly. The official's pen stopped moving. That depends on whether compassion pays its taxes. They dismissed him after 15 minutes. No verdict, just a warning. Surrender the horse within 7 days or face seizure of property. As he stepped back into the sunlight, he could feel every eye in town measuring him. Half pity, half curiosity.
As if kindness were a sickness they didn't want to catch. Thorn was waiting at the post,
Head high, watching him through the shifting light. The air between them carried the faint smell of rain and iron. Mateo touched the horse's cheek, fingers brushing the pale scar where chain had cut flesh. "They want to make you a weapon again," he murmured, "but you're not theirs." The storm broke that night. It began with a low rumble that rolled through the valley like the echo of distant cannons. Rain fell in hesitant drops, then in torrents. The barn roof leaked in 6 places. Mateo worked by lantern light, patching holes with old feed sacks while Thorn shifted uneasily in his stall. Each crack of thunder made the horse flinch, memories flickering behind his eyes. When lightning split the ridge, Thorn reared, striking the door so hard it splintered. Mateo dropped the hammer and moved close.
"Easy," he whispered.
"It's only noise, just noise." But Thorn trembled, chest heaving, until Mateo pressed his forehead to the animal's neck. The contact steadied them both.
Rain ran down Mateo's back, soaking the worn collar of his shirt.
"You've survived worse," he said. "So have I." By dawn the storm had passed. The valley steamed beneath a pale sun, fields glistening like wet stone. Mateo stepped outside to find half the fence line washed away. As he surveyed the damage, the low growl of engines approached. 2 trucks crawling up the road, each bearing the Baron's crest. He knew what they had come for. When the first truck stopped, 3 men climbed out, rifles slung loosely across their shoulders. The steward followed, dry as ever, holding a folded sheet of paper in one gloved hand. "Mr. Rivas," he said, "I trust you received our notice. We're here to enforce compliance." Mateo stood between them and the barn. "There's no compliance here."
"Only living things." "Then I suggest you step aside," the steward replied.
His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked toward the rifleman. Thorn sensed it before anyone moved. The horse emerged from the shadow of the barn, immense and silent.
Mud clung to his legs, rainlight rippling across his flanks.
The men froze. Even from a distance, Thorn's presence filled the yard like thunder. Mateo raised a hand. "He won't hurt you," he said, though the tremor in his voice made it sound like prayer. The steward adjusted his coat. "You misunderstand. This isn't about harm. It's about control." He signaled, and one of the riflemen took a step forward. Thorn stamped once. The sound cracked the air like a whip. The movement that followed was not violence but refusal. A single, perfect act of stillness. Thorn planted his hooves and lifted his head until the chain scar caught the light, an emblem of everything done and undone. In that frozen moment, the rifleman hesitated. The steward's command caught in his throat. Mateo walked forward, placing himself at Thorn's shoulder. The rainwater on the ground mirrored them both, man and horse, scar and scar, equal in defiance. "You want him?" Mateo said. "Then write it down. Write that a free creature was taken from his home by men too frightened to face what freedom looks like." No one moved. Even the wind paused. Then slowly, the steward lowered his hand. "You'll regret this," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. He turned back to the truck, his men following, rifles slack against their sides. When the engines started again, the sound seemed smaller than before. Thorn let out a long breath, the kind that empties years of fear. Mateo leaned against his flank, exhaustion rolling through him. Above them, the clouds thinned, revealing a slice of blue. For the first time in months, sunlight reached the valley floor without smoke between. The days that followed were a quiet miracle. The neighbors who had once whispered now brought feed and tools. Marta returned with bread and a story about her father's mare. The boy came back, laughter bubbling where silence had lived, and Thorn. Thorn moved differently, no longer cautious, no longer waiting for the world to close in. When he ran, it was not escape, but expression, hooves throwing light with each stride. Mateo watched from the fence, the rhythm of gallop echoing in his chest. He understood now that redemption wasn't something granted by others. It was built quietly, out of defiance and care. On the 7th evening, when the sun slid low and painted the ridge in gold, Mateo walked to Thorn's side and slipped a new halter over his head. Soft leather, no chain, no metal, just trust. "You're free," he said, though both knew freedom had already begun. As darkness settled, he left the barn doors open. The night was cool, filled with the sound of frogs and running water. Thorn stayed by the doorway, looking out toward the horizon where the first stars blinked through the fading blue. His breath rose in gentle clouds, steady and alive. Sometimes the hardest climb is not up a mountain, but out of silence. Mateo had done both. By midsummer, the valley had healed in quiet, unshowy ways. Grass reclaimed the burnt scars, slow and patient. The stream ran clear again. Wildflowers, those small gamblers of the earth, began to bloom where the flames had once licked the soil bare. Mateo took their return as a sign, not of luck, but of endurance. He worked each morning before sunrise, shirt damp with dew, Thorn grazing near the lower fence. The horse had grown heavier through the flanks, muscle replacing memory. Sometimes he would gallop the length of the pasture with no reason except to feel movement, mane streaming like smoke in reverse. Mateo watched him run and felt his own lungs loosen. But peace, even earned, was not immune to history. One morning a letter arrived, not from the Baron this time, but from the courthouse itself. It wasn't a summons. It was an apology. A brief, bureaucratic acknowledgement that records concerning the military animal identified as Thorn had been destroyed in the fire that consumed the local archives. No further action required, it concluded, as ownership cannot be proven by any party. Mateo read it twice, then folded the paper and set it beside his father's photograph. He did not celebrate. He simply exhaled and stepped outside into the light. He found Marta waiting by the fence, her hands twisted in her shawl.
"There's a boy," she said.
"The one who visits Thorn sometimes. He's fallen ill. They say he asks for the horse." Her eyes flicked toward the horizon. The mother doesn't know if he'll last the week. Mateo didn't hesitate. Within the hour, Thorn was saddled, the two of them climbing the winding trail toward the village. The heat pressed down like judgment, but the horse moved steadily, hooves finding rhythm even on the loose shale. When they reached the boy's home, a small wooden cabin crouched by the river, the air smelled of herbs and sweat and worry. Inside, the boy lay pale and motionless, a hand clutching the edge of the blanket. His mother knelt beside him, hollow-eyed.
"He hasn't spoken," she whispered. "He just listens. I think he's waiting for something." Mateo stepped back and motioned toward the door.
"Bring him outside," he said, "just for a moment." They carried the boy carefully into the yard, where the grass bent under Thorn's shadow. The horse lowered his head, nostrils flaring, breath washing gently over the boy's face. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the boy's fingers twitched, reaching upward. Thorn leaned closer until his muzzle brushed the child's hand. The boy's lips moved. A single sound escaped, soft, broken, but alive. A word Mateo couldn't quite hear, though he knew its shape. Home. The mother wept openly, clutching her child's hand to her chest. Thorn stood motionless, a sentinel of calm, until the sobs gave way to quiet. Only then did he turn his head slightly, as if to look at Mateo. And in that gaze, Mateo saw something shift, an understanding that all the pain, all the fire, all the defiance had led to this moment of pure exchange. The horse who had once been chained and condemned had become an anchor of hope, not through miracle but through endurance. When they rode back at dusk, the valley was all color and breath, gold dust floating in beams of dying light, the air warm and sweet with the scent of new hay. Thorn moved easily beneath him, each step deliberate. Mateo touched the horse's neck and murmured, "You've repaid more than any debt could hold." Thorn tossed his head lightly, as if rejecting the idea of owing anything to anyone. The chain scar caught the fading light, no longer a mark of captivity, but a signature of survival. At the crest of the ridge, Mateo stopped. Below him stretched the land, his land, reborn from ash. Smoke from a neighbor's hearth curled lazily upward. The world had continued without asking his permission, and somehow that made him feel free. He dismounted, loosening Thorn's reins, and let the horse wander into the open field. The wind tugged at his sleeves, the last warmth of day sliding from the air. Mateo closed his eyes and listened, to hooves in grass, to water moving unseen beneath the earth, to the sound of life rebuilding itself. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for something to end. He was standing in what had already begun. Dawn came slow that morning, spilling through the valley in ribbons of gold. The mist hung low over the pastures, softening the edges of every scar the land still carried. Mateo stood at the fence, coffee steaming in his hand, and watched Thorn grazing in the half-light. The horse's coat, shining like smoke, turned silver. The fire, the storm, the trials, all of it felt far away now, part of a different life that had burned down to its simplest truth. The world still asked for labor, but no longer for sacrifice. Each task, mending, planting, tending, carried its own quiet grace. He no longer measured time in debts or seasons, but in moments like this, breath, stillness, the easy weight of belonging. Across the pasture, the boy from the village was there again, small and whole, sitting cross-legged in the grass while Thorn cropped nearby. His mother waved from the fence, laughter breaking the air like sunlight through cloud. The boy's voice carried faintly, a story about rivers and giants and horses who could understand dreams. Thorn listened, ears twitching, patient as always. Mateo smiled. He didn't interrupt. Some stories belonged better to those still new to wonder. By mid-morning, neighbors began to arrive. Marta with bread, Benjamin's grandson with nails for the new gate, the older women with baskets of herbs. No one spoke of miracles anymore. They simply came to help, and in helping, remembered how. The valley had turned from rumor to rhythm, from solitude to community. Thorn had become part of its language, not a legend, but a reminder. As they worked, the light shifted. The breeze carried the scent of cut hay, the murmur of bees moving through the wildflowers that now quilted the fields. Someone began humming an old ranch song, soft and tuneless, and one by one others joined in. Mateo leaned against the fence post, sweat on his brow, and let the sound wash over him. It was imperfect and human and alive. Later, as the sun began to fall, he saddled Thorn and rode toward the ridge, the place where the first fire had come and where freedom had once felt impossible. The trail was overgrown now, the blackened trees sprouting tender shoots. The ground, even scarred, carried green. At the summit, he dismounted and looked out. The valley below stretched wide and endless, a living mosaic of color and memory. The creek glittered through the fields like a vein of light. His father's old fence lines were visible again, bent, but standing just like him. Thorn stepped beside him, head high, mane rippling in the warm wind. The horse turned slightly, pressing his muzzle against Mateo's shoulder, not as comfort, but as recognition. The man had freed the horse. The horse had freed the man. Neither owed the other anything more. The sky blushed orange, then violet, then the soft grey-blue of evening. Mateo took off his hat, letting the breeze move through his hair.
"You can go if you want," he said quietly.
The world's big enough now. Thorn didn't move. He simply looked toward the valley. Their valley. And exhaled. The sound was deep, content, final in its peace. Mateo smiled, a small, tired, grateful smile. He slipped the hat back on, took a last look at the horizon, and began walking downhill. Thorn followed, slow and steady, the two of them casting long shadows across the golden grass. Behind them, the wind whispered through the young pines. Not of endings, but of continuation. The valley would remember them, not as legend, not as tragedy, but as proof that kindness could outlast even fire. And somewhere in the distance, a new foal nickered for the first time. Life, unchained, had begun again.